What is media literacy? Hey everyone, today we're going to tumble down the rabbit hole that is media literacy, and we're going to do so by checking out the term media literacy. So throughout this video, we'll look at a couple of definitions, but I've always equated media literacy with communication literacy. I'll explain. So if you haven't checked out my previous video on the medium, you can check it out here. In it, I noted that every form of communication requires a medium or a channel, the means by which we convey messages, ideas, data, content. So we've used media vehicles throughout recorded history. Some of these accounts are questionable. I won't rehash it. What I will reiterate is that in the absence of a physical medium, such as a website or a billboard, a smartphone app, cinema screen, or a book, the medium conveying the message or the idea is just another person. So to get the gears turning, I ask, what do we do as children in everyday person-to-person conversations or interactions, whether it be in the house or on the playground? First, we identify the type of message or communication. Hey, that's funny, or that's not true. These are subjective designations. Then we categorize the person communicating with us. We do all this subconsciously. I can trust her. Now, this guy makes me mad. As children, as those of you with children know, we aren't born with the skills to make these determinations. We develop them over time through experience and familiarity with different types of people, relying on family members, community members, and other mentors. As we get older, we learn to interpret more sophisticated messages or content. Is that sarcasm? Is he trying to manipulate me? Is this opinion, fact, or rage bait? What is their communication goal? Again, as children, we do all this subconsciously, and for a while, we are mostly inactive participants in the communication process. Only after we learn social cues and how to speak, write, or otherwise, can we become active participants and convey our ideas to others. So now let's look at the term literacy. According to Google, literacy is the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, and communicate using printed and written materials across various contexts. I like this definition, but note that it is specifically for printed materials. It falls short of being a definition for media literacy, but the verbs are appropriate. As children, we first learn to identify the language and understand what words and symbols mean. Then we learn to use those concepts to create and communicate our ideas. But speaking is far easier than writing. The word that stands out here is interpret because there are different levels of proficiency regarding interpretation. For instance, understanding the metaphorical phrase, she was a fish out of water, and the literal phrase, she was a fish out of water, requires a higher level of communication proficiency. Like reading comprehension programs of the past, legitimate media literacy programs are not gatekeepers of truth. They don't teach students what to think. They don't tell them which communicators are legitimate or illegitimate or good or bad. They don't teach them whether content is true or false. They teach students how to think critically so they can understand, categorize, and interpret content for themselves. The goal is to teach them how to fish, not to fish for them. So whether we're talking about spoken word, printed materials, or modern interactive media forms, developing these critical thinking skills can take years. Is this advertising? Is she a journalist or a public relations professional? Is this propaganda or entertainment? Are they exploiting my weaknesses? What is their communication goal? Complicating these interpretation processes are the sophisticated media technologies that make up our rapidly changing media landscape. What I like about Google's literacy definition is that it includes language about the ability to create and communicate, which are active processes associated with content creation. But the problem with the term literacy is that it is fluid and often used interchangeably with proficiency. This makes sense, but it can add confusion to some discussions. For instance, I've recently heard terms such as computer literacy, information literacy, social media literacy, digital literacy, and news literacy used interchangeably with media literacy. These are all specializations that fall under the broader umbrella of media literacy, but for those who specialize on those areas, these designations make perfect sense. For instance, it's quite different to be computer literate than to be media literate. As an older person, I can vouch that the term media literacy was around before digital media, social media, computers, and the internet. From what I've seen, others in this space agree that media literacy is grounded in critical thinking skills. So now let's look at how dictionary.com defines media literacy. The ability or skills to critically analyze for accuracy, credibility, or evidence of bias the content created and consumed in various media, including radio and television, the internet, and social media. This definition is good, however, it applies more for nonfiction, such as journalism, information, or academic content. Does this mean that there's no use for critical thinking skills with fiction, or movies, or music, or interactive content? Aren't these influential as well? So now let's look at a different definition. Media literacy now defines media literacy as the ability to A, decode messages, including the systems in which they exist, B, assess the influence of those messages on thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and C, create media thoughtfully and conscientiously. So let's take a closer look at this definition. We'll start with A. I absolutely agree with this. The term decode refers to the ability to understand context, jargon, symbolism, metaphor, and so on, which is crucial for interpretation. Additionally, they use the term systems in which they exist as a catch-all for all types of media vehicles or networks. This definition isn't strictly for nonfiction. With B, I agree with this as well. They include language related to awareness of the various ways that content can impact or influence us. But I emphasize that awareness can take years to develop. With C, notice how this definition includes language about the active role of content creation, not just the passive role of content consumption. This is a relatively new aspect of media literacy, driven by the ability of newer interactive media platforms to reach large audiences. Before around 2000, the average person didn't have access to a platform that could reach more than a handful of people. Overall, these are good definitions and reflect that media literacy itself is an evolving field due to the changing nature of media. On the positive side, many minds are at work defining what should be included in media literacy programs. On the negative side, they don't always agree. As I mentioned, I use the term media literacy interchangeably with communication literacy, as a medium is required for any type of communication. At this point, I'll share that I've always used the classic communication model for traditional media as a framework for all media literacy topics. Here's the diagram. It's an older diagram, but it's a vital tool we can still use. Notice the four basic components of the basic communication model are: 1, the message sender or content creator; 2, the message or content; 3, the medium or channel; 4, the message recipient or content consumer. Notice the flow of communication only goes one way. That's because this diagram was created for traditional media. This diagram is deceptively simple because each component is a rabbit hole in its own right with enough content to fill an entire university course. For example, with a message or content, we can scrutinize for logical fallacies, framing, cognitive biases, rhetorical appeals, dog whistles, loaded terms, signaling, semiotics, trigger words, cultural jargon, priming, and much more. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, it is, but we don't have to be communication experts to begin our media literacy journey. Critical thinking with communication is all about familiarizing ourselves with various communication concepts or tactics and developing the habit of asking questions about the content creator, the message, the medium, and now more than ever about ourselves, the content consumer. And just like when we were kids, the most important question to ask is, what is their communication goal? So on a side note, the term critical thinking comes from the Socratic method, which originates from philosophy. Media literacy is like philosophy in that it isn't about dogma or pushing an ideological perspective. It uses reason and logic to critique our influences and explore why we know what we know. And like philosophy, media literacy is interdisciplinary, stealing topics from sociology, neuroscience, rhetoric, psychology, media technology, and more. While it's true that some of the more sophisticated topics require an elevated level of self-awareness, that doesn't mean fundamental ones like the definition of a medium can't be explored at any age. My goal is to connect each topic I introduce to a component of our basic communication model, reinforcing the fundamental ways we share ideas, impact, and influence each other. In my next video, we'll take a closer look at our communication model, and I'll examine how it's been updated with additional components to accommodate for new interactive media platforms. As always, whether you're already on your media literacy journey, know someone just starting out, or want to connect and collaborate, hit those links so we can explore together. Till next time, servus.